everybody, and welcome to another program with Florida-friendly landscaping here in Hernando County, Florida. I have invited my guest, Dr. William Lester, no, Bill, to the one that you're scowling about, yes. He's joining us this morning. Welcome, Bill.
Good morning. How are you?
We're doing just great. He's helping me keep an eye on the waiting room, as well as he's going to join us with his expertise this morning. We're going to have a kind of a different program today. Everyone loves programs about pollinators. It usually garners a lot of attention. But, you know, I was thinking there's a lot of pollinators out there that are just working. They're just working real hard, but they don't get the attention that the beautiful butterflies and the dragonflies and, you know, the honeybees, the things that we, for whatever reason, consider cute or beautiful. They get all the attention. But today we're going to talk about those plain pollinators out there. They're not the cool kids, you know, but they're, a lot of them are doing a whole lot of work for us out there. Nothing wrong with the beautiful butterflies, nothing wrong with the beautiful hummingbirds, nothing wrong with the dragonflies. I love all those things as much as anybody else. But we're just kind of giving recognition to all the other hard workers out there who may not, you know, be as physically attractive to our eye, but they're doing a fabulous job out there. Oh, I forgot to change this from last week, but here's our, yeah, no, Bill. We're getting some interesting people trying to join us, and we're just trying to keep everybody safe. This will be recorded. So if you are interested in watching it, it'll be on my Facebook page this afternoon. It'll be on Hernando County Government YouTube as well, probably in a few days. If you have any questions for me, my name is Lilly Browning. I work with Hernando County Utilities. And my email is lillyb@hernandocounty.us. I used the same slide last week, forgot to fix my font there. And Bill's email is wlester@ufl.edu. That's the best way to contact either of us. And with any questions that you might have. Here are the 9 principles of Florida-friendly landscaping. I show them to you every week, and today we're going to cover attract wildlife in our plain pollinators program. So, okay, I'm going to shrink down the waiting room, so you'll have to keep an eye on it, Bill. There are more than just one type of pollinator out there. There's what they call the intentional and then the incidental. So intentional almost always is going to be bees. They are really created specifically for the act of pollinating. And in this picture, you can see they have here what's called a pollen basket, where he, like, it's part of his structure. And that's where they collect the pollen. And bees, pollen sticks to them very easily. They have all these little hairs. You can see where it is also sticking to him. And they have these specialized structures for success in actually gathering pollen. They are highly mobile. They move around a lot, but this is very important in that they will visit many of the same type of flower. That is very important in pollination. If he jumps from one flower to a totally different kind of flower to a totally different kind of flower, obviously pollination is not going to occur. You have to take pollen from, you know, a male flower or a flower that is both, but then you take it to the same type of flower, the same kind of flower, a daisy to a daisy, so that pollination can occur. Almost all the time, it's the most efficient creature at doing that is going to be a bee. Now, there are incidental pollinators out there. meaning that just going about their daily lives, they happen to pollinate things. It's not really their intention, but the pollen is on them and it gets transferred around. Butterflies are so wonderful to have. We all want and have butterfly gardens, as do I. They're wonderful to watch, but they are not the efficient pollinators like the bees. They happen to pollinate because they're visiting flowers, but they also are not particular, they'll go many different kinds of flowers sampling that nectar. Therefore, if they happen to take the pollen from a daisy to a daisy, yeah, then they're going to help with pollination. The same thing with moths and some of these other pollinators. Now, we need all of it together. We need those really efficient bees, but we need the incidentals as well in mass to make this whole thing work. So we'll get to bees, but we're gonna talk about a few of the critters here in Central Florida who may not be as well known for their pollinating abilities, just because they're not that attractive. They're not the cool kids, but we are bringing them to the highlights. So there's two beetles. I asked Dr. Lester, since he's the bug doctor, to highlight for us and tell us a little bit about.
Sure. It's very common to see different species of beetles on flowers and feeding both on the nectar and on the pollen. If you are ever out on a hike in the woods and you see different wildflowers growing in a field or in the woods, especially this time of year, if you look closely, you're going to see soldier beetles on the flowers. And you need to be very, very careful with them, because we have soldier beetles and we also have blister beetles. And blister beetles are able to shoot a spray out of their rear end to keep predators away and keep people away. So if you go and you start trying to catch them, sometimes they'll spray you, and some people can have a bad allergic reaction to it. It'll make your skin on your hand actually blister up. Some people don't have much of a reaction to them, and they're really not that big of a danger out there, but you do want to be careful. But yeah, soldier beetles are very, very common feeding on pollen, on flowers, and also certain wood borer beetles are very common out in the woods also. And the adults will visit flowers and feed on a little bit of pollen and nectar when they're adults. The immature beetles feed inside of trees, and some of them are very important pests of trees. We have ash borer, which isn't a huge problem in Florida because we have very few ash trees here, but it is an important problem further north where they have a lot more ash trees in the forest, and that's an invasive wood boring beetle. But yeah, if you're ever out on a hike, especially looking through a field or a hike through the woods, you'll see quite a few different beetles feeding on flowers. And I think maybe your next slide has the most common one you're going to run across, that guy on the bottom, the common flower beetle. If you have flowers in your yard, you'll see a lot of these beetles flying around your yard. And I used to have them the last house that we lived in, and they'd fly around, they smack up against the windows, the side of the house. They're large beetles. I mean, they don't bite, they're not going to injure you, but they're very, very common. It can actually be a pest for corn growers, because if you think about it, if you're growing corn, the tassel on the very top has the pollen that has to fall off onto the ears of corn and pollinate them. These beetles are attracted to corn to feed on all that corn pollen on the top. So the adults do feed on pollen. A number of other scarab beetles, rainbow scarab, what else do you see? June beetles, the large green June beetle, they can all be attracted to flowers to feed on a little bit of the pollen and some of the nectar when they're adults.
Okay, thank you, Bill. So the type of plants that beetles are most attracted to, and I'm not going to list specific plants. I have pictures of specific plants, but it's going to, show you basically what we're looking for, what the beetles are looking for in the types of plants that normally attract them. So they like bowl-shaped. So you're seeing this tulip tree there and this magnolia, kind of bowl-shaped with exposed sexual organs. Oh my goodness. The stamen here, is what attracts the beetles, such as these two types of flowers. Generally, though, they're going to look for something kind of white, dull white, or even green. So these plain pollinators often are looking for plain flowers as well. So there is definitely a place for plain in your garden. Don't overlook plain. They like things that are strongly fruity, going to attract, with that sweet smell, and that are open during the day, and that are moderate nectar producers. They're willing to do the work, to get the nectar out of the flowers. And they like large solitary flowers, such as, the magnolia and the tulip tree there. Or they also work well with clusters of small flowers. We see that on the goldenrod beetle that we just highlighted. And now remember, the goldenrod, it's very important to remember that it is pollinated by a beetle, because that tells you something very important. It tells you it's not pollinated by the wind. Therefore, what do we know about that, Dr. Lester?
It means that the plant requires that beetle to pollinate it. And another little point about beetles and pollination, for people who live in South Florida, there are a number of different tropical fruits that are exclusively pollinated by specific species of beetles. And for some of those plants, because they're native to South and Central America, we grow the plants here, but we don't have the beetles here. So you're probably going to have to go out there and hand pollinate them. If anybody's familiar with dragon fruit, which is a cactus that flowers and gets a wonderful tropical fruit on it, a little tough to grow here in Hernando County. We're a little far north, but down there in Miami and Homestead, they grow it commercially down there. They have to hand pollinate it because it's generally pollinated at night by a species of beetle. And if you don't have that beetle, then you have to take care of the pollination work. So beetles for certain plants are very important pollinators.
Yes. But back with the goldenrod, it is pollinated by insects, by the beetle, not by wind. Ragweed is pollinated by wind. And what often happens is goldenrod gets framed for something it didn't do, which is fill up your sinuses and give you allergies. That's ragweed. Now, sometimes goldenrod hangs out with ragweed, so it gets caught hanging out with the wrong crowd, but it is not the one causing your allergies. It's a great plant to have around. Now we're going to get to the bees, our most efficient pollinators. And I don't have on this list here European honeybees, mostly because, remember, we are highlighting the not cool kids, not the ones who get all the attention. European honeybees do get a lot of attention, and for good reason. They're wonderful. We need them. They were brought over here, obviously, by their name, by Europeans, probably the Spanish to begin with, and then the over in Jamestown and everything, they brought them. And the reason people have been keeping bees for probably since biblical times, so they were very well versed in having these honeybees pretty well tamed and knowledgeable, familiar with the crops that the Europeans wanted to grow here. So they brought them with them in order to have successful crops, because our native bees probably would not have recognized those crops as anything they should, see as a plant, not for quite some time, for many, many years. So the European honeybees were brought over. They're very useful. We do need them. We do need to protect them. But in that process, we sometimes forget we have a whole lot of native bees in America, in Florida, and they are working really, really, really hard as well. And when I say the European honeybees are not native, they're not native to the Americas, but you know, generation wise, they've been around a whole lot longer than any of us. But overall, I would say they're naturalized, they're not native. Let's concentrate on our native bees. Dr. Lester, let's concentrate on these two types here, the sweat bees and the long-horned bees.
Sure. All of these different bees are very, very common, especially if you have patches of flowers or wildflowers or native flowering plants, or even patches of weeds. Right now, I noticed that the Biden's alba or Florida beggar tick, or what else is called Spanish needle, all the same plant, just different names, is in full bloom. And if you go out and look at a patch of it, you're going to see just a multitude of different species of bees. Sweat bees are very attractive. They are like the picture here, they can be metallic green, they can be a bright metallic blue. They're really eye-catching and very common. They are actually attracted sometimes to, if you're outside working in your garden and you're all sweaty, they're going to be attracted to your sweat and they'll start flying around you, but you don't have to be afraid, they don't sting. With any of these bees, probably if you catch them in your hand and start poking at them, they can sting, but they're not going to sting unless you catch them and start poking at them or aggravating them. Longhorn bees are a little less common, and they get their name because they have really long antennae. And native bees are very important for pollinating crops also. People might think that it's mostly the European honeybees that we need for pollinating our fruits and vegetables, but I know I read research on pumpkins, and we don't grow a whole lot of pumpkins here in Florida, but they do up north. And I think this was in Pennsylvania. They found that growing pumpkins there's a native bee that's called the squash bee, and it was responsible for like 90% of the pollination because it does a really good job of crawling in that pumpkin flower and moving around and going from flower to flower and really attracted to pumpkins and squash and things like that. And they are responsible for most of the pollination up there. And they were looking at ways of conserving that species of bee because the pumpkin growers depend on it. You know, if they want a good crop, they want to harvest a lot of pumpkins, you need good pollination. So sometimes European honeybees aren't the best choice. But yeah, we have over 300 varieties of native bees here in Florida. Many of them nest in little holes in the ground. We get calls every summer about, I have these little holes in my yard and bees are coming and going. What do I do? Leave them alone. It's okay. They're very, very rarely aggressive. The worst problem you're ever going to have with them is sometimes you'll have bumblebee nests, and this is more for people who live out in the country than people who live in more suburban Spring Hill. And if you get near the nest or start stepping on the ground right above it, they'll come, you know, flying out at you. Most of them are fairly docile bees, but some of them do. If you're familiar with the little bee hotels, you could build a little structure and put bamboo in it. About 1/3 of our native bees do nest in those little pieces of bamboo. So that's a great way to attract them. But 2/3 of them live in the ground. So just if you leave them alone, they'll generally leave you alone, and they'll pollinate your flowers, pollinate your plants, and pollinate your vegetables. This includes things like leafcutter bees, which I know we have here in Florida. I've never really encountered them before. They will actually chew little pieces of leaves off, and they take them to their nest, and that helps to build their nest. They use it as nesting material. Mason bees, they're the most common one that builds nests inside of little pieces of bamboo or any little twig that's hollow inside. Bumblebees, we're all familiar with them. We have a number of different species of bumblebees. Cuckoo bees, they're brightly colored, and they go to other bees' nests and lay their eggs in with those bees' eggs. So the other bee raises their young, kind of a tricky
Foster.
plan there. Little foster parent scheme, I guess, among
Yes,
bees.
yes.
Mining bees are the most common ones that dig holes, and you'll see, I've seen before in a kind of dirt, sandy area, lots and lots of little holes in the ground with bees coming and going. They're just mining bees, plasterer bees, melitid bees. So we have a lot of different families of native bees here. And like I said, if you go out and you look at just a patch of flowering weeds and just pull up a chair and sit there for a while, you'll see all these different bees come by and visit. You would be amazed at how many different species we have here in Florida, besides the traditional European honeybee.
Yep. And if you sit near a patch of that Biden's alba, the Spanish needle,
Mhm.
the vagary,
Goldenrod is flowering this time of year.
yeah,
That
you
attracts a
will
lot of bees.
see all sorts of bees and other things all over it. And as Jim Moe in Pasco County often says, there are lumpers and there are splitters. So here in FFL, we're definitely lumpers, meaning these are categories of bees. There's categories of leafcutter bees, then there's subcategories within that, and the same thing all down the line. So it's our native bees are I think a fascinating thing to learn about. And they pollinate many, many different types of plants. And the great thing about them is they'll forage at different times, depending on the different kinds of, bees that we have out there. They do provide crop pollination, as Bill was just saying. The bees that were, obviously in their past, they went to the same family as squash and pumpkin. So they were able to evolve and recognize, and, they're relied on to help with these pumpkin crops. And there are others, if farmers out there, they do bring in, they rent beehives and to help, but that is just almost like the icing on the cake. If they didn't have their native bees around as well, then the whole thing would just fall apart. So, and they do it more effectively than honeybees. And also because they exist and they're out there, they do provide that hedge of protection. Honeybees, as we know, in recent years are undergoing many different issues with hives dying out. I don't know all the diseases. I'm sure that Teresa, who works with Bill, she's a beekeeper. She's much more knowledgeable about, all the issues that the bees are having. But the native bees also, help, because it's not just a monoculture of bees, one type of bee. Therefore, diversity is always the key to a healthy ecosystem. So just different type of bees out there who may not get the same diseases or the same problems helps with that hedge of protection. And as we said, they are the most important and most efficient type of pollinator that we have. So the type of plants that native bees prefer are ones that are very full of nectar, brightly colored. They love brightly colored, sweetly aromatic, or minty, either one. And they like the ones that are open in the daytime and that provide a landing platform. You see this bee on this coreopsis. It's a nice place for it to land and to sit. And this bilaterally symmetrical, that means the sides mirror each other. Kind of like this petal looks like that petal, or tubular man, I'm from the 80s, tubular flowers with nectar inside, your long-tongued bees, that's what they're great for. There are short-tongued bees, there are long-tongued bees. Bees are a fascinating subject. I would recommend, researching more and learning more about them. But we're going to break away from bees. Oh, and back though, wait for 1 second. I was going to say, we're talking about the less well-known pollinators. Bumblebees, they're very much a native bee, but they kind of move up the scale in popularity. they kind of still get some attention because they're cute. But a lot of these other bees, people didn't even know that we had them. Now let's far down and say flies. Why do you want to talk about flies for? Dr. Lester, can you tell us about the, I guess it should say American hoverfly?
Sure, we have a lot of species of flies that when they're adults visit flowers and feed on the nectar and the pollen. Hoverflies do that. And we have a huge number of species of hoverflies here in Florida. They are different shapes, different sizes, but an awful lot of them mimic bees. So at first glance, you may look at this and you go like, well, that's not a fly, because you might be thinking a house fly. That looks more like a bee. And there's species that are larger and look just like a bee or a wasp. So they do that to mimic them so that they're not eaten by predators. But hoverflies are also called flower flies. And if you look at a patch of flowers or a patch of weeds, you'll see lots and lots of hoverflies. Now, they're very beneficial in the garden for another reason, because when they lay their eggs, the immature hoverflies feed on aphids and other little pest insects. They'll feed on mealybugs sometimes, thrips. So it's a very, very important natural control for aphids, which are a very, very common pest in the garden. So having a lot of hoverflies around is, has a lot of different benefits.
And I think the hoverflies have been given a pass, because even me, I would have assumed it was one of the small native bees because of its striping there. So I didn't even know it was a fly, but doing a great job for us. Let's talk about, Dr. Lester, drone flies within the hoverfly grouping, and other horseflies, which no one really likes having them around, but they do pollinate as well as deer flies.
Sure. Here at different times of the year, we have a lot of deer flies, we have yellow flies, we have horse flies, and those are all common names. Yellow flies are the smaller ones that are kind of yellowish striped. We have the horse flies, which are a really huge, pure black, shiny fly, and they will bite the heck out of you.
Yes,
but as adults, they do visit flowers and feed on at least a little bit of the nectar and pollen. So they're not really major pollinators. It's just another insect that does visit flowers and does technically help with pollination, because if they go from flower to flower and they catch the pollen on their feet or their legs or their body parts, you can see the hairs on the underside of their body, they're going to move that pollen from flower to flower. So one of those things that you may not think of that's pollinating things out there really is.
Mm-hmm. And the type of plants that flies generally go after are going to be pale and dull to brown, dark brown or purple, sometimes flecked with translucent patches. I'm thinking of horse mint, dotted horse mint. That'd be the same type of thing. Although I have some Dutchman's pipe right here. Putrid odor. Interesting, of course. All flies are attracted to a putrid type odor. And sometimes it's even the carrion smelling type plants that flies do pollinate. And they go after plants that produce pollen, and they like the funnel-like or complex traps. Hence, we get to know the carnivorous plants. It's many times that flies are the ones going inside of them to get that nectar and end up getting trapped there. And then the plant, uses the fly's protein to continue growing. And here I have a picture of Dutchman's pipe, which flies also help pollinate as well. Can you think of any other type of plants, Dr. Lester?
No, I know there are really obscure, what is this? It's a special orchid or bromeliad that when it flowers smells really horrible. It's supposed to smell like dead dead meat or something.
There's
And
voodoo
that
lilies.
is to specifically attract flies, because that plant has developed to do that to attract flies for its one and only pollinator.
Mhm.
But most plants don't follow that plan,
Right.
fortunately.
Now wasps. Now wasps get a really bad rap because they hurt. They hurt when they sting. They hurt worse than bees. You get a bee sting, it hurts. You get a wasp sting. There's a reason, I guess they say mad as a hornet, because it hurts so much it makes you mad. So, and they get, a bad rap. But the thing is, back to that lumpers and splitters, if you just say wasp, there are so many different type of wasps, and some of them are so tiny, they couldn't possibly hurt you. And those ones are actually beneficial in that they help control aphids and mealybugs and all that Bill talked about. But we do have some that are actually pollinators. So Bill was talking to me yesterday about the fig wasp. So obviously that's an interest of his. And the paper wasps are very common on our porches and everywhere, and very unliked. So let's talk about them.
Sure. Well, if you're out looking at a patch of flowers or a patch of flowering weeds, you'll see paper wasps and a wide variety of different wasps visiting the flowers. As adults, they do feed a little bit on nectar and pollen, and they also get water off of those flowers. But adult wasps are also very important predators, because if you have paper wasps, the ones that build a nest up around the eaves of your house or underneath your power meter outside, the little cells they make, they'll go out and they'll catch a caterpillar, they sting it, put it in the cell, and that's what they lay their eggs in. And that is a food source for the immature wasps. So wasps could be hanging around flowers looking for a caterpillar, or feeding on nectar, or feeding on pollen, or looking for water. So they're very, very common out there visiting flowers also. But all wasps in one way or another are beneficial as predators. But for figs form a very, very unusual specialized kind of fruit. When a fig, the fruit is young, it has a hole on the end. And there's a very specialized, one species of wasp per type of fig per part of the world that is going to go into that fig and pollinate it, move pollen around within the fruit, and then it stays in there and dies in there. So I don't want to discourage anybody from eating figs, but every fig technically has the remains of a very, very tiny, like half the size of a grain of pepper wasp inside of it that pollinated it. And over in Europe, where they grow a lot more figs than we do here in the US, there are individual specialized species in different countries, one in Italy, one in Greece, one's in the Middle East, in different areas. And the figs depend on that wasp for proper pollination to actually make a proper fig fruit when the time comes.
Okay. We'll talk about two other type of wasps here.
Cicada killers are a very, very large wasp. And please stop contacting the office or putting on Facebook that you have a murder hornet, because if you're in Florida, you don't have a murder hornet. What you have is a cicada killer. They have different coloring. If you see pictures of both of them side by side, you can tell the difference. But cicada killers are a very, very large wasp that live here in Florida. They're out this time of year. They live in holes in the ground, and they will go and catch a cicada, the big insects that are up in the trees making all the noise in the summer, and carry it back to their hole and sting it and paralyze it and lay their eggs in it. That's how they got the name cicada killers. They're not a major source of pollination, but any wasp, yellow jackets also, has the possibility or the potential to visit flowers. And obviously, if they go from flower to flower to flower, they're helping to pollinate it. So they're not major pollinators, but in the flower garden, they're going to be present and you're going to see them visiting sometimes.
And back to flies, Kathy told me that carrion cactus attract flies as well.
Sure, there are specialized plants that you can get and add to your garden if you want something really, really different. There's a corpse orchid or corpse
Yes.
bromeliad, I think.
Yeah, I think, yeah, and it grows
Yeah.
huge. Yes. And we have voodoo lily around here too. And
Yeah.
that has a certain point where it smells like rotten meat. It sounds something like great to have in your yard, but some people like just to do something different.
Well, if
So
you want a
now,
good plant collection, you start looking at all those really unusual things to add to it.
yeah. Now we're going to move on to moths. Kind of the ugly ducklings in the butterfly, in the Lepidoptera world, I should say. Their pretty cousins get all the attention. And meanwhile, these moths are also working very hard. Now, what I don't have here is a Luna moth because it's one of the cool kids and gets a lot of attention because it's so beautiful. But we're going to talk about kind of just the plain old moths and the jobs that they're doing. The white-lined Sphinx moth, I think I have down here in the down here, but I'm also showing you how there's a whole group of what we call hummingbird moths. And I just had this experience literally this morning. I've had this many times, but a nephew of mine in Tallahassee sent me a picture of a video of something zipping around. Can't tell from the video, but he said it's the smallest hummingbird he's ever seen. When people say that, that kind of gives you a hint, probably some kind of hummingbird moth. They don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear they saw a moth when they thought they saw a hummingbird. Every time I'll get a denial, but it is within the realm of possibility. And before Bill discusses, I'll show you up here, in case you can't see the moth. There it is on that tree there. And Dr. Lester, can you tell us a little about these moths?
Sure, we have a number of different species of different Sphinx moths here in Florida. They're in the family Sphingidae, that the Sphingid moth or hummingbird moth. And they're large moths. They are mistaken for hummingbirds. And if you're ever standing there and one of them flies up and starts feeding in a flower, they're loud. When they're beating their wings, they make kind of a buzzing noise, might be a little frightening or kind of get your attention. But it's just a moth. They're not going to bite you. They're not going to sting you. And they are very important pollinators for any plant that flowers at night. So if you have a night blooming jasmine, many of our different cacti flower at night, and some of them will actually get fruits that you can eat. So if you have a flowering cactus or flowering cereus or
Yeah,
night blooming cereus,
Mm-hmm.
which is a type of cactus that flowers at night, go out there at night with a flashlight and you'll see moths, and then you'll see toads and frogs that are trying to eat the moths, and you'll just see a whole different world out there in the dark at night that's all working hard to pollinate those plants. So even things that flower at night have their specific pollinators, and it's almost always moths, because moths are out at night also. We have a number, and you're mostly going to see these if you live out in the country, because most of these are more forestry type moths. You mentioned the Luna moth. Their caterpillars will feed on pignut hickory and more forestry kind of trees, not the kind of things that you would see in a normal urban or suburban backyard. But sometimes if you get up early, you walk outside, you'll see a huge moth on the wall of your house by maybe a night light that you keep on all night. So things like an imperial moth, giant leopard moth, Cecropia silk moth, Polyphemus moth. These are, what are they, 6 to 8 inches across, very large moths. And they will visit flowers that bloom at night and feed on them and help pollinate them. The giant leopard moth, that's pretty common. And you'll see that comes from caterpillar. It's not a woolly bear. It looks like a woolly bear moth. It's very spiky with spiky hairs, and black and has red stripes around it. So pretty common caterpillar. They eat a lot of different weeds. That's why they're so common. We all have weeds, whether you live in the city or out in the country. And their moths are pretty common. And they're all very, very attractive, very,
Mhm.
very,
It is
they'll
not,
definitely get your
right.
attention when you see one.
Yes. So the types of flowers that moths like, as Bill mentioned, ones that bloom at night, obviously. But they also like, even for the daytime moths, some daytime moths are going to like bright colors. I've seen plenty of moths around my scarlet sage. They like it with the landing platform or a lot of clusters, something to land on. They do like white, especially those night, almost all night blooming things are white, I think, pretty much. And moths are attracted to that, or dull colors, except for those daytime moths, which do like the bright colors. Majority of your moths like the ones that open in late afternoon or at night, and they like it with a lot of nectar, things that produce a lot of nectar, or that they like to go inside and find that nectar inside of a lot of the plants. Now we just have a few more that we're going to discuss, and Karen from Hernando County Mosquito Control is hanging around in the background. She has,
I think you have to make her a co-host.
Right, well, she has technical issues.
Oh, okay.
So she doesn't have her camera or microphone working, so she's just kind of hanging out with us. But mosquitoes, believe it or not, there's two good things we can say about mosquitoes. One thing is that they do happen to pollinate. You can see, look at this picture. There's pollen stuck on his legs. So if he goes to the next plant of the same, he's going to be an incidental pollinator. And I'm saying he, because the he's do live on nectar alone. The females also do some nectaring, but when they are going to lay eggs, they need protein. And where are they going to get that protein from? Going to get it from me, or you, or a horse, or a dog, from a blood meal. So yes, in case you did not know, the only mosquitoes biting you are the females. Dr. Lester, we're going to leave that one alone. I'm not going to let you go.
I wasn't going to say anything.
And that's the one good thing about them, is they can pollinate. The other good thing is they're a food source. There's for other insects or bats or things such as that. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep them under control, because number one, they can spread diseases, and number two, they are a pretty big nuisance for us. But everything has something good that it was created to do in nature. I say that not believing it about roaches, but I will ask you later what roach. I guess I know they're carrion eaters and all of that. Yeah, they're garbage collectors. Another insect that has a lot of people think, and in past they thought, well, ants are pretty good pollinators, and they're changing their minds about that. I don't know what it is about peonies up north, but ants are always all over peonies up north. Have you noticed that, Bill?
Yeah, well, ants can be attracted to sweet, sugary substances. Think the ones that sneak into your kitchen and might be on your countertop, the little ghost ants and pharaoh ants and things like that. Ants kind of fall into two big groups. Some of them like sugary substances to feed on, other ones like high protein things to feed on. So the sugary ones are going to be attracted to flowers and the nectar, and that's what they're looking for.
Right, but they are not greatly effective as pollinators. They'll move from flower to flower, but they are really there to get that nectar. So they're very efficient at stealing the nectar. I've read, the forestry department just calls them thieves. They're very efficient at getting that nectar, or even some honeydew, which is a whole nother story to tell you about. We discussed it in last week's program, if you want to go back and see that one. So they're just there to get that nectar, and you would think, well, don't they then incidentally spread the pollen around? They don't really have the hairy bodies to do that. And they're finding out that they secrete like an antibody, which protects them from fungus and different things that they might come across collecting nectar. But unfortunately, that antibody they secrete within a very short period of time kills the pollen cells, kills the pollen, effectiveness. So somebody in a lab figured that out. So ants have been kind of pushed out as, being considered much of pollinators at all. That does not mean you need to worry about them or, try and get them off your plants. They're part of nature, just like anything else. So if you have a moderate amount, those plants are still being pollinated by our more efficient pollinators. Usually nature, if we leave it alone, will balance itself out. Bats can be pollinators, but not here in Hernando County, correct, Dr. Lester?
That's correct. I don't know of anything that's particularly pollinated by bats here, by the different species of bats that we have here in Central Florida. Maybe in South Florida and definitely in tropical areas, South and Central America, there are a lot of tropical fruit plants that are pollinated either exclusively or the majority of the pollination is by bats because they flower at night. Bats are out at night. Bats are attracted to the nectar and the pollen. And obviously you can see from the picture here, they are furry. So they're going to get lots of pollen on them. And when they go from flower to flower to flower, they're a very important pollinator, but not so much here.
Right. And back to that carrion cactus that Kathy told us about, she has one. She's in St. Augustine, and she has one by her front door because she wants to keep the salespeople away. Well, it won't stop them from calling like they're doing to you.
No,
right?
apparently it won't.
And Karen is saying hello. Karen Mojico from Mosquito Control. She is silenced, but she is telling us hello. So, pollinator-friendly yards. How are we going to attract these plain pollinators? The good news is exactly the same way you're going to attract all those pretty pollinators as well. The same principles will bring everyone to the yard. Reducing or eliminating pesticides. Would you like to cover that one, Dr. Lester?
Sure. For attracting any kind of living things really to your yard and garden, you really want to think long and hard about using pesticides. And we're not saying that there's never a place for them or don't use them, but you need to start with number one. You should be able to put this in writing and say, I'm growing a plant and I have this pest. I know what the pest is. And the best way for me to control it is to take this step or this step. If that doesn't work, I'm going to have to spray starting with this product, starting with the least toxic material that's going to still be effective. And then if worse comes to worse, work my way up. And if you take those steps, you never have to work your way up very high up the chain. So I think everybody kind of skips step number 1, 2, 3, and 4, and they head straight for, I'm going to go to the shed, I'm going to grab a jug of whatever I happen to have. And if it's a broad spectrum insecticide, it's going to kill your benefit. It's going to kill most of the pests, going to kill all the beneficial insects that are helping to keep them and other ones under control, going to put a big dent in your pollinator population and start to kick things out of whack. And you may have really unusual outbreaks of other things that you never had a problem with before because you've upset the natural balance. So you can use pesticides, just try to reduce the amount you use, try to be very, very specific about what the pest is, what you're trying to accomplish, and what you're using to do that with.
And we're going to have a class.
Great. Sure, you want to do native plants?
Yeah, I'll do that one.
Sure.
We're going to have a class on kind of what Bill described was integrated pest management. He just described that to you. And it is a pyramid that you work your way up. And we're going to have a class specifically on climbing that pyramid. And you just made me think that the bottom part of the pyramid is prevention, which is the widest, the most thing you should do. I think we should have something under that that is called identification, because find out maybe and probably that's not a pest that you're looking at. So I think you do need to start with ID and knowing what you're dealing with, because you may be, just because a bug is on your plant doesn't mean it's a bad bug. And just because a bad bug is on your plant doesn't mean he's there to do damage. If there's a small amount of them, as Bill said, let nature take care of nature for you instead of upsetting the balance. And one good way of doing that is planting native. We're not saying you have to be exclusively native. This is a yard of a master gardener that volunteers for Dr. Lester. I'd say it's 95% native. The more native plants you have that are native to Central Florida, the more pollinators you're going to have. Stands to reason, doesn't it? That's the plants that they are bred, to know and to look for. Also, though, plant diversity, different, and by plant diversity, I mean different species of plants, but also different flower shapes, different flower colors, different sizes and shapes of the overall plant. All these things are going to bring more pollinators and more different types of wildlife into your yard as well. Clusters of flowers all together. One great way of helping pollination is planting in mass the same flower so that, the pollinators have an easier time. They're going to take pollen, from one to then the same type of flower, have it all together. If you had one black-eyed Susan and then the other black-eyed Susan 20 feet away, an insect, probably would not find it very well. So plant together in mass, but also you can combine. My wildflower garden in the front, it's it's chaos, but the pollinators love it. Stagger those blooming times so that not everything is blooming simultaneously in your yard, so that the show is always going on in your yard. There's just different actors who have come on stage. And embrace the circle of life. We've touched a little bit on that when Dr. Lester talked about the wasps. And some of you may have cringed when he talked about the wasps and caterpillars, because yes, sometimes they go after your favored caterpillars. And, sometimes, unfortunately, we just have to accept that some things were created to be a lovely nutritional food source for maybe the birds. It all works together. We want to have a lot of control, and we want to have the pretties have, an extra advantage, but when it all comes down to it, if we let nature do its thing, generally it knows what it's doing. So here are some of the resources that I utilized researching this. If you would like a PDF copy of this presentation, go ahead and email me. I'll put my email back in a second and ask for a PDF of this. And I'll also put Dr. Lester's email, so you can get some of these websites where I found a lot of this information. It was very interesting researching it. The Sharon's Florida talks a lot about native plants. She, at one time in the 90s, Dr. Lester, she was a Hernando County master gardener.
Okay.
And she's an expert on native plants. Sharon LaPlante is her name. So I accidentally ran across her website and I was like, oh, I know her. And she's got some really good information there, as well as these from Hillsborough County and Native Plant Society, and a lot from the federal parks, all of these. So you can email me and ask for a PDF, or email me, and if you only want these links, I'll email those back to you as well. And Bill and I have been getting a lot of questions lately of whether there's certificates available for these programs that we teach. And these particular ones are just for homeowners. So there's no certificates involved with those. Here's some upcoming classes. You can find all of my classes on Hernando County Government YouTube. If you want to go back and see last week's, which was, what did we talk about last week? It was something, pest insects. And we talked about integrated pest management and all of that. Or you can find a whole lot more. Go to Hernando County Government YouTube. Just Google that and you'll find it. Here are the upcoming classes. I highlighted these 3 because compared to last week, the dates changed. It's kind of been the theme of the last year and a half, hasn't it been? Like, whatever plans you make, they're almost bound to change. So if you've been waiting for a program on mulch, you got good news, it's coming sooner than we thought. Years ago, Dr. Lester had to fill in for me for a in-person class on this much ado about mulch. And he said to me, who can talk for an hour about mulch? And what did you find out?
There's a lot to talk about mulch.
Yes, yeah, there is. And we have at the end of October, different rain barrel classes coming up. Then November, Master Gardener Secrets Revealed. See, I've known the Master Gardeners, at least the program, longer than even Dr. Lester has. So I have access to some of their secrets, and I'm going to share that with you. Then the one I mentioned, climbing the IPM pyramid, that's integrated pest management. Dr. Lester will join me with that. And as a follow-up to our pest insect program we had last week, we're going to have beneficial bugs. So we're going to talk about the good guys this time as well. Here again is our emails if you want to contact Dr. Lester, wlester@ufl.edu. You can contact me at LillyB, Lill, 2 L's, Y-B. Oh, this is my old one, at co.hernando.fl.us. You can also just do at Hernando County, all spelled out, .us. Either of these will get to me. And we both have Facebook pages for you to follow and keep up with our classes. And again, Google Hernando County Government YouTube.
And I put in the chat for everybody, if you just go to Hernando Extension, all one word, .com, you'll find a full listing of all of our upcoming classes between myself, Lilly, everybody else that works for Hernando County Extension. Full listing of everything that we have coming up.
And thank you again, Bill, for joining us. And what I should have added here to all these resources was just a picture of your head, because I also get a lot of things out of his brain as well. So, and if you email him, you can do the same thing. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we will see you next week for Much Ado About Mulch.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you.